District has a very special place in our hearts. It is the site of the historic Chinatown. There is an historic Chinatown. It is on the National Register. Historic Nihonmachi, or Japantown, as well as Little Manila, or Manila Town, and Little Saigon. But we've also had a history, as I said, of other communities of colors getting their first start in the International District. That means that the history of the International District is intertwined with the stories and narratives, I think, of racial bias and discrimination and oppression based on power dynamics between the white male majority and those of us of color. One of the things that I wanted to just sort of highlight is many of us became aware of the ongoing discrimination against Asian Pacific Americans in the last year following the racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd on national television. And I guess what I want to make sure that we understand is this is not new. What we saw in Georgia is not new. That has been with us for as long as there have been Asian people on in the United States. You can go to the Asian Exclusion Act. You can talk about the coolie labor that helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. You can talk about the incarceration of Japanese Americans. Asian American Pacific Islander hate is not new, and the first thing that we can do to beat it back is to understand its origins. I did mention to Serene and others earlier that one of the things that I'm doing back here on the East Coast is I'm attending the National Asian Pacific American Caucus of State Legislators, where I'm proud to say that as a founding president of this organization, we grew from a small ragtag group of probably about 100, most of them coming from Hawaii, to actually we have 164 legislators in 33 states. That's 33 states have at least one Asian Pacific American state legislator. We were able to hear from Erica Moritsugu, who is the White House liaison to the Asian Pacific American community, as well as Crystal Kai, who is the executive director of the White House Initiative on Asian Pacific American Affairs. And what I'd like to do now is just on a very 30,000 foot level, share with all of you what some of the issues are that face your Asian Pacific American neighbors and community members. Some of the things that we have identified, there are really 6 areas, are around visibility and access, around health equity. I mentioned anti-Asian bias, Asian American education, technology, and broadband. The Asian Caucus has passed a number of resolutions to address several of these pieces, but the 2 that I really, really want to focus in on for our group is the importance of disaggregated data. How important that is, that we cannot lump all Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders together, in part because our experiences are not the same. And I think you will hear that from Rahul and Serene and Joseph later on. That's my timer saying I've talked for 6 minutes. So for just another minute, I'm just going to complete that thought. If you are talking about things like affirmative action, it is important to separate the experiences of, say, Chinese Americans who have been here for 5 generations, or Japanese Americans or Korean Americans, for example, from our refugee populations, our Vietnamese, our Hmong neighbors. Actually, one of the things that you will find is that our Southeast Asian neighbors actually have the highest poverty and the lowest educational rates. That is all hidden when we aggregate Asian Pacific Islander data. So disaggregated data, I'm proud to say we in Washington have been a leader in the country around disaggregating AAPI data. The second thing that I really want to focus in on as an important feature is the importance of language access. We often take for granted that when there is going to be language accessibility made available to persons whose first language is not English, we often think of Spanish, and that's important because so many people do speak Spanish. But Asians are the fastest growing population in the United States, according to the last 2 decennial censuses. Why? In part, it's because of reproduction numbers, but it's also because the main way that Asian Pacific American communities grow is through immigration. And so we have to be very mindful of the fact that if we are going to be inclusive as a society and bring these new Americans into the fold, because we can't, a lot of Asian Pacific American immigrants have a very different sense of what it means to be a Democrat or a Republican that is informed by their experiences at home. Excuse me, at home. We need to make sure that we are providing them with every opportunity to engage in civic engagement. I know Joseph will be talking more about that a little later on, but I thank you all for taking on the subject and giving me the opportunity to give a high-level overview. And so with that, Serene, I'm going to hand it back to you and say thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Representative. Honestly, we could stop it right now, and we've already covered so many of the issues we were going to discuss. I am now just going to add the spotlight to Rahul and Joseph and remove it from, so we all get set up, because we are recording this. We felt that, you know, these are important topics and it's great to be able to refer back to them. So, okay, great. We're all set, ready to go. So again, I mean, Representative Santos touched upon many of the topics that we are going to discuss this evening. And now I'm really excited to formally welcome Rahul Gupta of the Wing Luke Museum of the Asian Pacific American Experience. If you have not been there, I highly recommend a visit. And then also Joseph Lachman of ACRS, Asian Counseling and Referral Service. And both of these organizations do incredible work here in the in the community. So before we get into some of the topics that we're going to discuss, which include the diaspora and our history, Joseph and Rahul, I'd love to just learn a little bit more about each of you and the organizations that you represent. I also want to clarify that they are joining in an organizational and nonpartisan capacity. So Joseph, kick us off.
All right, thank you so much, Serene. It's you know, really an honor. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. And it's always a pleasure to be alongside Rahul at any kind of event like this. And again, my name is Joseph Lachman. I use him as pronouns. And I am the policy analyst at Asian Counseling and Referral Service. And we're an organization that was founded in Chinatown International District and in the historic 37 district area. It's been here since 1973. We expanded to having a main office down on Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue, but we still continue to serve a large number of community members in the Chinatown International District and kind of South Seattle, you know, part of King County. And I am curious, by the way, if anybody feels like noting this in the chat, if you know actually which ACRS service is still located in the Chinatown International District area, or if you've ever been to, you know, our building or anything. I would love to know, because I'm always just curious kind of how if folks have heard much about us outside of the immediate community that we serve. But just, you know, very quick overview. You know, we're an organization. We have around 300 staff serving over 30,000 community members every year, providing services such as citizenship help, job placement, English as a second language classes, nutritional and exercise programs for elderly, youth leadership, and then just one of the main things we are known for is behavioral health services. So that's addiction or treating just folks with behavioral health or mental health issues that require a higher level of cultural competency and linguistic sensitivity that a lot of mainstream organizations historically have not been able to provide to our community members. So, Rama, thank you so much for that. Appreciate that. So, with that, I'll actually hand it over to Rahul and I'll continue on in a bit.
How do I follow that? I was going to say something in a completely different way. My name is Rahul Gupta. I'm the education director at the Wing Luke Museum. Our museum has been around for over 50 years, named for Wing Chong Luke. He was the I thought I had turned off my phone and I thought I had disconnected it from my computer. I have it recorded.
We're in a no judgment zone here.
Okay. So we've been around for 50 years and we're named for the first Chinese American, but also the first person of color ever elected to office in the city of Seattle. He was elected in 1962. He passed away in 1965 in a plane crash, and the community, there was kind of a groundswell of support to honor him and honor his legacy, which was, as Representative Tomiko Santos just said, open housing. What many Seattleites still, even people who've been here longer than I have, Serene, something's going on and I need to mute for 1 second.
Serene, I did want to say one thing, by the way, that Rahul hasn't quite gotten a chance to talk about how amazing the Wing Luke Museum is yet, but I just wanted to share that it's a place that I've been going. I just live down the street from it, basically in in the neighborhood, and I've been a member for a few years at this point, and it's one of the I actually think it is probably one of the best kind of Asian and Pacific Islander museum facilities just in the entire country. So
the only one like us, Joseph. We're the only ones like us.
Rahul, please continue.
Sorry, so sorry, folks. I'm so sorry. We started out as predominantly focused on the Chinese American experience, rightly so, being Chinese American himself. But in subsequent years, as this notion of Asian American really takes root, you see other organizations like the International Examiner and International Community Health Services. ACRS springs out of that. The Asian Resource Center, just an interim. They just birthed these amazing organizations that have really wrapped themselves around not just the existing population, but the new populations coming in. And there's always a challenge with that. And we should note that for down later in the conversation. It really dovetails on what Representative Tomiko Santos said about disaggregating data and being very clear about what that means. There's real life, real people are affected by policy decisions that only reflect this Asian American identity. And the thing about the Asian American identity is the Wing Luke has always promoted this idea as long as I've known the organization, since 1995. I haven't been there since then, but I knew it. And I did apply for a job at that time and they didn't hire me, and that's their fault. But at the same time, you have this Asian American identity, this umbrella that's about their safety in numbers. What we're seeing now is that there's something very freeing about it, but there's also something very limiting about it. And we can get into that. But where it's freeing is understanding the connections between experience. And the museum has focused on understanding real people's experience through oral history. Our collections is made up predominantly of what families have donated or loaned to the museum. Some people keep some of their prized possessions with us because there's something that happens in our communities over and over again. And again, Representative Tomiko Santos mentioned it. This is not new, this idea of anti-Asian American. And we keep saying anti-Asian, it's anti-Asian American. It's against the idea that we actually have a vested or earned or otherwise interest in what happens in our own country. And so this constant movement of forever sort of making us foreigners goes long ways back. First with the Chinese. The first Chinese immigrant landed on the shores around 1860. His name was Chin Chun Hock. You all drive over the connection between, I can't remember the name all of a sudden, between Lake Washington and Lake Union. Well, the first part of that cut, the Montlake Cut, was actually completed by Chinese. Most people don't even know that. And the reason was they were some of the only ones with that kind of civil engineering experience from back home, but then also here working on the Transcontinental Railroad, but also building the spurs in our area. Spurs going to Carbonado, going out to Black Diamond, and so on. So our whole state has rested on the labor of Chinese, but then also Japanese Americans. But here, I'm going to say it now, most people don't know how long my people have been in this area. And that is something that the Wing Luke has not focused on until now. Part of the reason for that is if you're grasping at which are the major stories, which are the ones that people are going to readily identify, you grasp for the Chinese or the Japanese or the Filipino, but less so for the Filipino. And this hierarchy that exists in terms of whose data reaches the top. Japanese Americans, 5 generations, Chinese, 5 generations. There's something called a discontinuous community. And the violence that has been perpetrated against us, and what we're seeing now, and especially last year with the anti-Asian American violence, we're not going to walk away from 9/11, and we're not going to walk away from the effects on our Sikh community, as well as other South Asians, as well as Arab Americans. And this idea of a discontinuous community is if you can keep segmenting away, which is why that umbrella of Asian American was so important. If you keep cutting away at the roots, then you never have anyone landed as an American. Y'all, the 37th district has changed a lot since I moved out of it. We used to be proud of the idea that it was 30-30-30, or 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 American, 1/3 white, 1/3 Asian American. And it has changed so severely in the time that I've been in Seattle that, and you look across the rest of what's considered the international district, things are changing. You want to get into issues, we can get into issues, but the fact that that has changed so rapidly within 20 years, just completely cut, it's yet another example of a discontinuous community, which says, well, we don't see you now, so when were you here? Wing Luke grounds our stories so that people know we've been here.
I mean, now how am I supposed to follow that up? Thank you so much for that. I think just so folks are aware of the kind of segment today, we're going to spend about 25 minutes discussing some questions that we've already kind of planned ahead, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, and I'll just ask folks to raise their hands or that is preferred, and then we'll pop questions in the chat as well for folks who aren't able to have audio issues, etc. So we'll just cover a few of these topics, and then obviously we'll open up for Q&A for what folks in our community are interested in. I just wanted to start with what we've been talking about in terms of the data and the complexity of the community. I was diving into the most recent census data just this afternoon, and it's incredible the change and the growth specifically in this community. King County is one of the top 20 counties in the country for the AAPI population, which is huge, which is about 25% overall in King County. It's interesting because when you look into the data, you can choose folks who identify as Asian, folks who identify as Asian in combination, folks who identify as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, or Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander in combination. And that's not even including people who might have self-identified as some other race, right? So it's, I mean, you can go down a serious wormhole, but the data is clear that in our community, there has been such a population growth explosion. Both populations have grown 40–50%, and we see it. I see it every day because I live right by the CID. And I would love to get your thoughts on, you know, when we're talking about ACRS and all those community members that the organization serves, and also all the visitors to Wing Luke, just your thoughts on that diaspora and how you see that surface in your organizations.
Thanks, Serene. I'll start this one off, that's okay. So just a couple things I want to also mention about my own background. So I'm a fifth generation Japanese American. So my great grandfather came over from Northern Japan, 1907. And he actually came basically directly from Japan to Seattle by boat. And he founded a church, and it's called St. Peter's Episcopal Parish. And it's just up on, it's just like 1610, I think, South King Street. It's very close actually to the Japanese Cultural Community Center of Washington as well. But that church is still there. My great grandfather's photo's up on the wall. You know, and it's just right within walking distance really of where, you know, where I live now. And, you know, that was, you know, that's 5 generations ago in my family. And the only time that they didn't live in this area was while they're incarcerated during World War II. And so that's, you know, there's a lot of grounding for me, and that I'm able, and a lot of history that I'm only actually in a lot of ways able to access because of resources like Densho, which is also nearby, and also the Wing Luke Museum. So, you know, there's an important grounding that I take in being able to do my work at ACRS and feeling grounded in the work that I do for them. Also just for a sense of like the, you know, the community that we're in here. One of the other services I wanted to see if folks knew about, actually, I was curious if folks knew about in this area, is the ACRS Food Bank. I think a lot of folks don't actually realize that, you know, the folks who are struggling with housing or food insecurity, a lot of them are our own community members, you know, from a lot of different, especially communities of color. ACRS has actually helped in a single year. This is just 2016 as an example. You distributed over 1 million pounds of food, and that was to nearly 6,000 individuals and families in the county. And, you know, it's a lot of our own community members, you know, who tend to be the ones who, you know, access the food bank. And our food bank is actually one of the only ones that so is regularly providing food that, you know, caters to the specific cultural needs, you know, of our community members, in, you know, including things like rice, tofu, soy milk, noodles, and those kinds of foods that they might not find at another food bank. So, you know, I would really encourage folks, you know, if you are able to in this area, you know, volunteer at the food bank sometime. You know, I think it's a great way to be just, you know, involved in something like, you know, with community here. And, you know, it's something that it's an opportunity. I think it's really good that that's available for folks to take advantage of. And thank you, Serene, for sharing that as well. Serene, was there any other point you wanted me to kind of touch on?
No, I think that's great. I think that shows, you know, the example of like why the work is so important. Also, it's so important to cater to the growing population. Rahul, your thoughts on just the diaspora and anything you wanted to add?
You know, it's funny, in collecting histories and looking at the physical record, which is essentially what we do as a museum. Our populations have grown in many directions. Predominantly, what I'm seeing is a considerable lack of documentation of Southeast Asian populations and Pacific Islander populations. And the power of those stories, especially as newer immigrants or refugees, speaks to how do I want to say this? I'm not going to say speaks to the American dream, but it really does tug on a heartstring that I think a lot of Americans are missing. And what I mean by that is I think we forget that while we claim to be a nation of immigrants, we're not solely a nation of immigrants. And that many of us born here, we're no longer immigrants. My children are third generation. They're not immigrants. And yet we would assume that they would understand, for example, the first generation Indian experience. And the reality of that is no. And when we start to understand all the little, I guess, paths that our stories take us, you don't necessarily see that reflected in the larger world. You might see it in ACRS, you might see it in International Community Health Services, you might see it in the Refugee Women's Alliance, but these are umbrella organizations. These come out of Asian American movement. But then within those same communities, they have their own structures. Well, how are we supporting those structures? How are we understanding maybe that the story is a little different when they talk to each other rather than talking to someone like me? And those are equally important to add to that mix of understanding the impact of whatever policy decisions we're making. The diversity of stories coming in, Hmong, Mien, Cham, Khmer, Vietnamese, Lao, very little Thai, very little Indonesian, but a lot of Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi stories. But you start to get a different sense of which populations are coming in from China now versus who came before, which were solidly Cantonese. And so even within that, you get this amazing mosaic. It's just this brilliant mosaic of overlapping stories. And that's Chinatown International District, and that is the 37th in my memory.
And I think you see it in us on the panel and Representative Tomiko Santos earlier, right? I am a first generation Chinese American. I'm 1.5, I call myself 1.5 because I immigrated as a child and spent many more of my formative years here in the United States. But my experience, and Joseph and I have talked a lot about the differences in our experiences with him being, like, his family having that over 100 years of history and mine having about 25 years of history here in this country, and where the similarities and differences lie, and the complexities of the language in particular. Sometimes even when I'm in the CID, because I speak Mandarin and not Cantonese, I don't, anyone looking at me might think, oh, I fit in, but actually I don't, because of all that complexity. And that's just this, we're only scratching the surface there. And it's really, Rahul, something you said earlier also really struck me about when groups get forgotten, because in this country, when we say Asian, they look like us. Like, that's what most people think is East Asian, not Southeast Asian, not South Asian, not Central Asian. When I lived in the United Kingdom, I lived in England for a long time, that was not the case. In England, Asian is you. Asian is South Asian. And I actually was really surprised by that I was, the demographic breakdown there, I could literally tick Chinese in a drop-down menu, because that's how the breakdown is there. So I want to turn to redistricting now because it's a really timely, important topic and talks about how our community and the impacts of what districts we're in are going to impact this collective voice or this disaggregated voice as we were talking about earlier. So right now, just for everyone's awareness, the CID, the Chinatown International District, is in the 37th completely, more or less completely. And there are 4 proposed maps right now by the different redistricting commissioners. 2 of them actually cut the CID almost in half, and 2 leave it mostly complete. And I wanted to raise that to everyone's awareness tonight because we are in this opportunity where people can go and comment on the maps. And that's what we're going to strongly encourage people to do. And I'll send that link through. But I would love to hear from both of you, and I'll turn to you, Joseph, first, about redistricting, why it's so important to keep the AAPI community together and the impacts if we don't.
Yeah, thanks, Serene. Again, we're only days away from the cutoff for the constitutional deadline for the Redistricting Commission to submit their maps to the legislature, and otherwise this process goes over to the courts. I bet a lot of people, if you're here at a 37th DENS meeting, that you probably are fairly familiar, at least with why redistricting is so important. I just wanted to make sure that folks had taken a moment to just look at especially the maps proposed by Commissioners Graves and Fain. Commissioner Graves and Fain, they both make proposals for redistricting that I think are an insult to communities of interest, and especially Asian and Pacific Islander communities, like the communities that we serve. In particular, looking at the map from, let's see right now if this is showing up. Try, and Serene, on this map here, type in Wing-Luke, just the Wing-Luke Museum, and you'll see what comes up right there. And you'll see actually this line. This is a very, it's a very insidious line in my opinion, and I don't want to make it sound like this is just purely a partisan thing, but it's actually an attack on our communities. This is a split that would damage the integrity, especially of the 37th district, because of splitting it off with the 43rd in this way. Commissioners Graves and Fain both proposed this kind of very inappropriate split along the freeway line, which is harmful, incredibly harmful to our communities, and would split up, especially Asian American, as the Asian American community of interest in the area. And the same thing goes actually with Graves' map as Fain's map, because both of them, actually, if you look at the other, and if you're type in actually Asian counseling, and you'll actually need to do the second one on South King Street. That's our food bank. And you can see again, it's right just on the other side of the line. So it's and you have community members from all around that dot who are coming to access the food bank. And it's just, again, a completely inappropriate split. As you can see where the central district is, you can see where Chinatown International District is. It's a very inappropriate division of our communities. And so we're really encouraging folks, as you can see on the right side, there's an add comment button there, and there's still time. I would recommend for folks like just putting in your address and then marking somewhere on, and seeing where you, if you haven't done it already, where you land on the map. And then just sending a comment to the legislators, especially Fain and Graves, saying that you dislike, this, this proposal, because of a current disagreement also about the viability of the current proposals related to the Voting Rights Act in the Yakima area. The Republican commissioners have actually entirely stopped negotiating with the Democratic commissioners to actually arrive at a compromise version that would we feel meet constitutional, meeting the constitutional deadline, but also meeting on the VRA muster. So that's just some of the concerns that we have there. And again, there's it really highlights the historic injustices in terms of, you can see where our communities have been forced because of a history of white supremacist policies in this area, and how those manifest in modern times. Rahul, I think maybe you might be able to speak to this even more, but I think the freeway itself is is symbolic in ways of the injustices that have been inflicted on especially heavily minority populated communities.
Absolutely. When you look at what we now call Little Saigon, that was all part of historic Nihonmachi. And that was very much the birth of the kind of organizing and politics that I came into moving here in the early 90s, of Asian, Black, and Latino and Native American organizing. And when you take a population, say, like the Japanese Americans, and you remove them from a place, you can erase their memory, you can pretend they did nothing, and there are people in our city who believe they did nothing in that area and they never were there, or in the Central District. That is violent, in my opinion, in that you can physically or even mentally remove people from what they've been and who they are. Well, once you remove a population from a place, it's really easy just to cut through with a highway. Well, to use that highway, which was historically really damaging, and still to this day, just looking at the Chinatown International District, you have Chinatown and what remains of Nihonmachi on one side and Little Saigon over here. What makes it worse is residential. In the Chinatown area specifically, it's higher density, populations living in the old SRO buildings as apartments. Over in Little Saigon, it was predominantly commercial district. And that was always one of the most harmful elements to establishing a strong base. When you don't have people actually physically live there, you can't ground people into understanding that that's your neighborhood. Well, now the population's coming in, you have all the development coming in from Vulcan. I'm not taking a stand on the development, but the populations moving in aren't specifically Southeast Asian, or even more specifically, Vietnamese. So as that population changes, you slice that district, now we have competing priorities. You can pretend this was never Little Saigon. You can pretend that it was never part of the International District. How long does that take? 10 years before people forget? But what makes it worse is actually on the ground. And I'm a board member of the International District, the CIDBIA, the Business Improvement Area. And we work with the Friends of Little Saigon. We have to work within historical confines of the historic district, but that doesn't keep us from being able to work with our friends and allies to strengthen both sides of the highway. But that highway causes problems now. Can you imagine a district just stripped of its history? And now you have two districts stripped of their history. It affects funding for businesses. It affects the way businesses operate. It affects who gets to define the way that is it still a neighborhood if it's not in the same district? So who gets to determine which direction it goes? We are fighting tooth and nail against gentrification. Tooth and nail. And this really sets us up for some damaging situations. And that's coming from a nonpartisan perspective. Slicing communities in two, never a good idea.
Absolutely. And we'll open it up to questions in a minute. And I think this topic was great to focus on because it is so timely and so important. And so, I think one of the calls to action is please go in and use your voice and comment on the maps to keep the CID together. Before we turn it over to Q&A, and again, raise your hand or post in the chat. Just really quickly before we turn to the Q&A, any other calls to action that for the members of the 37th, and I think I saw a few representatives also, like any other calls to action for our community to support the AAPI community or your respective organizations.
I do have a tangential one, Serene, and that's also the composition of the 9th Congressional District, because there is a push that would, because of the dynamics of the current, the commission and their discussions, there is a chance that much of, this area that's the 37th, that much of it that is in the 9th, a lot of South Seattle, Chinatown International District would get moved into the 7th District, which we feel, again, is not appropriate considering the much more aligned political interests of the CID area with, much more like South Seattle, in the South County areas, and would really encourage folks to also look at those congressional district maps as well, and express that, again, Asian American communities, this community of interest should be kept together with regard to legislative and congressional districts.
Thanks, Joseph. Rahul, a call to action from you before we got 4 questions already in line.
As a museum, there's not a call to action per se. I will say that, as Joseph just described, moving it to the 7th, moving it out of the 9th, you are basically silencing an entire chunk of population because it's never going to bubble to the top. It's never going to become a priority. And we've lived through this. And I mentioned discontinuous community. It's happened enough. And the fight for years has been to keep the integrity of that voice. The damage, I can't even imagine. The silencing of voices, be huge.
Yeah. So that's another reminder. Please help us with your voice in comments on all of these redistricting issues. So, Robert, you are first up. And we cannot hear. Wait.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. This I could not be more appropriate because we need your help too. I mean, we here in the central area, everybody knows about this Garfield super block, and I've gotten support from Representative Santos, a very good letter, and also from a 37. But when we worked on the Garfield renovation, one of the mitigation that I was able to slip in is to develop the whole Garfield campus block. And inside we have a history wall from the 1850s when Chief Selma was put off, going all the way through to Obama, showing how the Asian community worked with the Black community. And for example, there's not many of us know that the international district actually come all the way up past 23rd and Jackson, because the international district was a transit until you can get a job and get a house. So my dad, 56, moved there and got a job at Boeing's the next day. So we need your help in helping to keep that footprint. And the super block and historic art district, the work that we're doing is to have that footprint. We want to bring that artwork of the 7 different ethnic groups and physically put it on the Garfield campus. And I've been sending notes to you guys, all of you that's here, that I need representatives from you so that we can pull together or an art group, because I don't like other folks doing other folks' art. pull together an art group as well as pull together some artists that can really put artwork on that Garfield campus that reflect. And to even go deeper, Little Saigon shares the border with the western boundaries of the central area. And one thing that I would suggest, it took us 20 years to get our own design and review guidelines and our central area official map. I would suggest that Little Saigon, Chinatown, and International District do the same. So if you guys could send me somebody that can represent you on our art committee that we're pulling together. We've been meeting every week since all the way through COVID, working on this, and finally got city council looking at it. But I need representatives from each one of these 7 different ethnic groups. I guess you guys know who I'm talking about. The Wamish, Black, Jewish, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, and Italian, because they were all considered colored folks during that 1850 and 1860. So I don't know if you have my contact. I'll have our leader to send my contact to you and send me somebody, because we're in the middle of this and we want to get it done before another freeway is put down 23rd and Union. So the spirit is good, because I needed this, because I needed to get in contact with guys and keep on fighting. Don't hit up to that stereotype that y'all ain't got no voice and you're timid. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Right.
Thank
you.
you so much.
Robert, I just wanted to say one thing. So I was at Garfield during the renovation.
Ah!
I was over in Wallingford at Lincoln for 2 years until they finished it up, because they finished 2 years into high school for me. So I got to do junior and senior year back at Garfield. Yeah. So, oh yeah, I know all about it. Like, yeah. It's also same high school where my grandfather went to, and his siblings. You know, then they were finishing high school. They were trying to finish right as the incarceration order started. So that's my family actually left the area, but we're all right in there. We're all a whole bunch of us are Central District. You know, we're all Bulldogs from Garfield.
Your spirit is still there, and you know the simple thing like the Japanese architect had built not only the science center, but the Twin Towers came out of Garfield. And again, as you guys were stating, that's being erased. And I'm gonna let somebody else go, because I've been working on this for 15 years, and I've talked to them. So thank you, and I'm waiting to hear from you.
Thank you so much. And Joseph, if you don't reach out and follow up, we've all borne witness. Thank you so much, Robert. Tandy, you were up next.
I'm proud of what you guys are doing. Makes me feel good. Being born and raised in Seattle, the International District, Chinatown, is a part of my history too. So please, whatever I can do to help, because we've seen, and I've cried and I've screamed and I've hollered about what's happened from the central area to the south end. And I can't see anybody breaking up the International District any more than that big old thing that goes through the middle of the International District right now. It's like, what the heck? But it's, and so we all know. So like I said, that's always been a part of my life, Hambao and everything else. So everybody's got their spot on each corner, and what corner you go and get where you get your Hambao, where you get your barbecue, where you get your duck from. So yeah, whatever I can do to help you guys keep that from being gentrified, this sister's here to help you, for real.
Thank you so much, Miss Tandy. And I hear you. The only reason I have carried cash in the last 2 years is for the cake shop that only accepts dollar bills in the international district, and it's literally called Cake Shop. So if you haven't been there, highly recommend a visit and bring cash, because they've been open for over 30 years and, you know, are wonderful at mental math, because there's not a credit card to be seen there. Andrew, over to you.
Hi, I'm really excited about this panel, and Serene will tell you I've been like pushing for this since like the beginning of the year, like, because it's so important. As a transplant, a lot of things I learned about AAPI in Seattle was random. I remember I went to, is this Swedish or so? They have a small display about the when they sent the Chinese and the Chinese Americans out of Seattle. And that was like, we're talking in the 19th century. So it was not like 500 years ago. I'm really excited about this. Two things. One that I really thought someone would talk about is the stereotyping of the phrase ideal or perfect immigrants, and how it affects and goes down from generations to generations to generations. And two is regarding Seattle, what is being done to bring the real AAPI history and persecution of AAPI community, teaching people and the future about it, because I think schools should teach people. If not, history would definitely repeat itself like we saw last year.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think both of us are trying to look at Rahul's answer. We're all pointing at each other. I will say, just to kick off on the model minority front, the model minority, if you don't know the history of it, there are a lot of resources that talk about how and why East Asians in particular were held up as the model minority, which pitted us totally incorrectly and unnecessarily against other immigrant groups, and also held us up to a standard that frankly we're still dealing with, because and I'm sure Joseph and we can all like relate to having been put in that box, as I certainly was as the smart kid growing up. So you brought up two really important points, and I just wanted to pipe in before handing over to the more knowledgeable folks with me.
So Serene, I grew up in the South, and let me tell you, the model minority didn't fit outside in the rural parts outside of Houston. As far as they were concerned, I was a moron because I wasn't white. So, and I'm not a Christian. That made things totally, what a mess. But Andrew, to your point about the model minority, so much of what we do at the museum is teaching history, actual lived experience in history. What we're up against in terms of this perpetuation of the model minority is electeds often use it to their advantage, and we still get played in this political game of we count when it works for a vote and we don't count when no one wants to listen. And part of the problem too is, and this is a problem, newer immigrants are coming in with their own racial biases. And so while you have fourth, fifth, third generation Asian Americans of different ilk, right? They don't identify themselves as anti-Black, but that anti-Blackness is what model minority was all about. It was to drive a wedge between specifically Chinese Americans who weren't American until 1943, if it naturalized. They didn't get to be citizens until 1899, and they were here since the 1840s. Debatably longer, but we won't get into that. But 1943, they're an ally in the Second World War. Well, when the Japanese Americans come back, they're told you can't live together, you can't have nihonmachis, you can't do this. So everyone starts spreading out. Well, the voice gets thinned. and the memory of the incarceration disappears. It's the Sansei, third generation, that come back and they're like, there's some serious damage here. And then you start to see organizations like Densho spring up that specifically deal with that traumatic moment that has redefined the population. But we also have people within our populations who believe in the model minority. My parents have shifted. They have been here since, my dad since 1961, and he came believing that he was something special. But he was also coming from a poor family in India, coming here, and that was a really big deal. My mother came from an affluent family in India. They met here in Florida, go figure. And she came already feeling that entitled kind of feel. So they played us as kids to believe in this exceptionalism. And then we moved from New Jersey to Houston. Man, when reality hits, it changes everyone. And my parents shifted tune very, very, very quickly. And the reality of what it meant to be a brown person or a brown family in this country really, really hit home. And, you know, they were in post Jim Crow South. You know, they were denied entry into restaurants. They lived through that. And it still was like, well, that doesn't mean us. But now they're very clear that it means them. So you have this shift over time once you start to know the history. And the more you separate people out and the more you make it hard for them to even speak and share their history, you're not going to hear it. But come see me, I'll school you on some serious stuff.
Thank you. And I think, did that answer your questions, Andrew?
It did. Well, you know, I'm from Houston, so go Rockets. But yes, I always like that question because I can relate to the immigrant part and the pitting against immigrants. And even as a Nigerian American, I was always taught that I'm better than Black Americans because that's what the white people that brought my dad told him. And so I always like people to talk about that because it's part of why I feel there is a huge disparity between the immigrant community, the AAPI, and Black American community and African American community. And talking about it in public helps build that broken bridge together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And wonderful point. And I will say Andrew has been such an ally to me and always reminding that we want to do this panel. So thank you so much, Andrew. And we are about to wrap up. Mary, last question from you.
Oh, I'm honored. Thank you for this. And so first of all, I apologize. My camera's on the blitz, which is why you don't see my face. But I do have Serene to thank for pointing out the situation regarding the freeway. I haven't lived in Seattle that long, and she was the one who sort of opened my eyes to what has happened in that community. And so this whole discussion is fascinating to me. I hope you won't mind if we go back for one quick second to the issue of redistricting. I had one question. There was a comment kind of offhandedly saying that the commissioners aren't working together. And so I read that to mean that there might be a little bit of potential sausage making that could maybe be elaborated on just a tiny little bit. Are you in a position to say anything else about that at all? Like what the might mean for the decision or anything like that?
Yeah, I'll try to explain it as best I can. I have to admit that like my knowledge of, you know, the whole process isn't perfect, but my understanding is that so analysis came out recently that shows that all 4 of the maps that were initially proposed by the commissioners relating to the people of color, communities of interest, especially Latinx folks in the Yakima area, so for their legislative maps, they would all almost guaranteed be in violation of the Voting Rights Act because of their they would not be complying with because of the numerous court decisions that have been fought and they've have been reached related to racially polarized voting in that area. in response to the research, and also Serene, if you wouldn't mind, if you just Google crosscut Yakima redistricting, I think it'll come up very quickly. But there's a fight there, and Commissioner Walkinshaw, Commissioner Sims, both very quickly committed to releasing revised maps that would ensure compliance with the Voting Rights Act and respect for the communities of color, in particular that community of interest. However, Commissioners Fain and Graves have made no such commitment to releasing maps that would actually show even a basic level of respect for the Voting Rights Act challenges that have gone on in that area. So the issue is that if they can't just get a basic set of proposals that are for showing compliance with the Voting Rights Act, Democratic commissioners are not willing to, compromise to that extent, because it's assuredly, almost guaranteed leading to a lawsuit. However, if they don't find the compromise by the constitutional deadline this month, that means that by default, the process goes over to the courts to resolve, which has a sort of anti-democratic spirit, unfortunately, to it, just because of the nature of it. And we have a redistricting commission that, again, it's in some other states have, direct legislature directly controls the process, but in Washington State, we have a 5-person nonpartisan, a 5-person commission with, bipartisan structure of 2 from each of the main caucuses, and then one non-voting neutral chair. But that does mean that there's a very high chance of deadlock, which is unfortunately where they seem to be at right now. And there's a strong chance that there may be one more special business meeting scheduled for next Monday. And if that is the case, then I would highly encourage folks to just go to their Redistricting Commission's website and just sign up for public comment.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So I just want to wrap us up and thank Joseph and Rahul and Representative Santos who kicked us off earlier. I've certainly learned a ton during this discussion, and I'm so grateful to the 37 that we were able to finally do this. And again, thank you, Rahul and Joseph. This has been wonderful.